So I have the pleasure of opening this afternoon's final panel on New Horizons in Achaemenid Art and Archaeology. Our first speaker is Dr. Lindsay Allen. Dr. Allen is a senior lecturer in Greek and Near Eastern history at King's College, London, and a member of the Board of Trustees at the British Institute of Persian Studies. She obtained her BA in Classics from Oxford and earned her PhD in Ancient History at University College London. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2002 and has held research fellowships at Wolfson College of Oxford, the Warburg Institute, as well as the British Museum. From 2008 to 2009, in addition to her position at King's, she was a visiting research scholar at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World in New York. Her research explores the texts and material culture of Achaemenid kingship, a topic upon which she has numerous publications, and we here at UCLA were very fortunate to hear her present upon just last spring as a speaker at the joint UCLA-Getty Symposium on the World of Ancient Iran and the West. She also has a variety of published works on the rediscovery and reception of ancient Persian remains in Iran and Europe, with her most recent publication exploring the reception of pre-Islamic culture, specifically the Persepolitan reliefs in Iran. Dr. Allen is currently working on a catalog of some stone fragments, from Persepolis that were removed from the site in the 18th century. In her talk today, she will discuss the intentionality of embedded alterity as a phenomenon of Achaemenid self-definition in material and textual formats in her presentation titled Embedded Alterity, Material Hybridity as an Achaemenid Strategy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lindsay Allen.
Thank you so much for such a lovely introduction. And I should say that from my past experience last year, this place has already become associated in my mind with a really pleasant location to share ideas with colleagues and generate new ideas. I'm extremely grateful for this invitation to present this time. And I've tried to sort of, as you will find, refresh and shift on my thinking. Just on the topic of our project, really, in putting together, in sort of participating in these meetings, I wanted to. Sorry, it's now midnight in my head, so so you're hearing a delay there. I wanted to say that I endorse the ideas expressed this morning about collegiality and conversation, group participation in the formation of ideas. I feel like our endeavours in exploring Achaemenid history run in parallel to our conception of the Achaemenid Empire itself. So our self-awareness there perhaps needs to be developed. I particularly appreciated this morning the words of several people on the legacies of Helene Sanchisi-Würdenberg and Amélie Kurt as founding participants in the original Achaemenid history workshops. And I did just want to add my own personal note on Amélie, that she was the person who guided me into this universe as a graduate student, very kindly, very generously, but yet with an excellent bullshit detector, not protector. And her words, her kind of nuances of expression are really always in my head when I'm trying out ideas or thinking through ideas. I don't always live up to her standards in that respect, but she is very much missed, and really I dedicate this work to her and really everything that I am putting out. So on that rambly introduction, I wanted to come back to this topic today. I wanted to respond to the conference theme by looking more closely at this theme of hybridity in historical and material terms in the Achaemenid court. And this is a subject, I should confess, that has preoccupied me since I worked on the cultural evolution and reception of Achaemenid kingship for my doctoral thesis. Much of the material we use for such discussions of royal identity and imperial ideology is very familiar to all who work on the political and cultural history of the Persian Empire. That is, multilingual epigraphy, stylistic and iconographic integrations and appropriations, and grafted and adapted classes of objects. And I hope that that sort of summary evokes some of the things we talked about this morning as well. For the purpose of this paper, I wanted to use the phrase embedded alterity to question how the court environment under Darius and his successors used material culture to evoke distance and cultural hybridity in sort of the widest possible horizon. The evocation of imperial distances and variety at the heartland is something that we all observe and find fundamental to the articulation of Achaemenid power in our work. It's something that we often find encapsulated in the phrase unity and diversity and other such phrases. I feel like that is kind of bordering on also some of our conceptualizations of the universalism or the kind of aspirational universalism of the ideology of Achaemenid inscriptions. Yes. I give just two sort of classic examples of this unity and things standing in for unity and diversity in the environs of Persepolis. First of all, the zoological exotica and accompanying visual differentiation of their escorts on the north and east facades of the Apadana. And I could equally have included the foundation deposit texts from the Apadana foundation layer in this example as well, which evoke the edges of the empire. Second, on the tomb of Darius I, his direct address of his achievements, all about the extent and diversity of the empire again, and the distance reached by his martial prowess. Both of these articulations of distance appear in the unifying Achaemenid, I want to say lithic costume in these images. Both of these, it's a sort of modulated translation of Western Asiatic relief iconography and epigraphy as explored by Margaret Root, for example. And I want to take the space today to think more about so-called exotica and their implications in this kind of larger format of Achaemenid court environments, and to what degree they broadcast and then retain their foreignness in the Achaemenid environment. As short case studies of embedded alterity, maybe in material form, I will mention two general types of object today. First, some, I want to call it vintage, as well as exotic loot excavated in the Persepolis treasury by Schmidt in the late 1930s. And second, examples of external imperial legacies designed in as structural elements of Achaemenid palace architecture. The former has been explored before, most notably in Cahill's AJA article of 1985, discussing the Persepolis treasury. And the latter is something that kind of is implicit in our approaches to Achaemenid iconography more generally. It sort of forms the general framework to discussions by Mark Garrison and Margaret Root of adaptations of earlier iconography. But I wanted to focus much more specifically on this kind of aniconic evocation of earlier empires. This combination of case studies, I want to warn you, is an argument I've not attempted before. So I'm prepared to be, I hope, interesting rather than persuasive. And my aim is not to replace the multiple interpretations of material diversity in the Achaemenid Empire with just one read, but rather to nudge interpretation further in the direction of complexity and variation. In this way, I would suggest, I hope, I am following the productive investigations of imperial impacts, or as is often being said today, the imperial impress, in a regional context by Elspeth Dusenberry, whose work influenced my early conceptions of regional interactions. and more recently Laurie Khatchadorian, who expanded the mutable identities and meanings of objects in their adoptive communities. Part of something that I want to leave open by the end of this paper is how much exotic features and objects change their identity in imperial heartlands. And I think this may also touch on the objects as agents question that came up just more recently. In this way, I would say, generally, my contribution fits into Elspeth's category of Persian question mark. With definite emphasis on the question mark. As additional context for my thinking on this query of embedded alterity, I want to offer a simple geological metaphor, and this is by way of a substitute for a worked up and what would inevitably be a lengthier academic theoretical framework for the purpose of this discussion today. The geology on show here is a continuation of the limestone from which Persepolitan architecture in particular emerged by means of wedge, hammer and chisel. It's the wild and furrowed terrain of the western and southwestern Iranian plateau. And the two examples here of personal observation I owe to the flight path from Shiraz to Abu Dhabi, which is somewhat southwards of core imperial communication routes. And in showing you these images, this is what I meant by reflecting on how our analyses, our scholarly analyses, are paralleled by our research activity, research methodologies. I'm showing you my holiday snap, well, not holiday, but my travel snaps. So, as has been well studied in both prehistoric and historical periods, this terrain generated a broad spectrum of climatic zones. Its linear valleys accommodating a fluid network of connected communities, and in this conception, I'm particularly indebted to Cameron Petrie. In the Achaemenid period, this terrain lay between and interlaced the Achaemenid monarchy's developed monumental centres of Persepolis and Susa, as well as Babylon and Ecbatana. Indeed, as we know now, the early history of the monumentalization of Persepolis included the emergence of a Babylonian gate at Toli Ajori near Persepolis, or in the environs of Persepolis. This project, as the excavators deduced, was never completed, but envisaged as a project introducing something that represented the divine, social, and monumental geography of urban Babylonia to the Mav Dasht. The fact that this possibility existed as a concept, albeit not fully executed, serves to underline similar, if subtler, strategies later deployed in the development of the Persepolis Terrace. And I cannot emphasize enough how, I'm afraid there's no slide of this, but how much, whenever I think of Toli Ajori and its implications, it just completely blows my mind. But we can come to that in discussion. The Zagros transitional zone was also an interface between what we consider, from a geohistorical perspective, the territories of the Medes and the Elamites. The material legacy of the populations in these areas is an important component of the analysis of what becomes defined in our scholarship as imperial style, along with appropriations of and interactions with Assyrian monarchies in the West. By way of examples here, and the one on the left is perhaps a little bit more northeastern than the previous regions I've included, but just included for its well-known status. By way of examples here, I offer the gold cup of Hassan Lu on the left and the pre-Achaemenid metalwork assigned to the Kamalkara cave on the right, both photographed in Bonn in 2017. One on the left has an archaeological provenance, the other not at all, really, but both are representative of groups of material that have been also vastly smudged in the scholarly lens by the production and circulation of unprovenanced and fake objects. So this is both an undefined series and interrelated series of zones in the archaeological and ancient context, but also in terms of our the availability of material for our firm analysis. The Elamite, Median, and later Achaemenid kingdoms held embedded within their territories then, back to thinking about the mountains, a sort of gnarly fascia of rugged terrain settled by diverse peoples. This zone historically accommodated multiple contact zones between polities, particularly within the living community memory of the Achaemenid Empire between tributary, semi-tributary, resistant, exploited, and independent communities, with the politically and culturally dominant centres of Iron Age Mesopotamia. Across the board, then, the incorporation of recognisable citations from past and foreign royal environments can be interpreted in general as the appropriation of legitimacy, the acquisition of a cloak of authentic royalty, and this is something that we come across a lot in our existing literature. The act of monumentalising space at centres like Susa and Persepolis alone is the first step in this aspirational assumption of a dominant imperial identity. And I could talk a little bit more about luxury tableware as one of our most common, and as Elspeth brilliantly illustrated this morning, very reliable indices of Achaemenid influence, but I want to sort of skip past that. But I do just want to say that it has become one of the sort of classic repositories of discussion of Achaemenid imperialism as a process, as an elite process that spreads across long distances. The consistency of Achaemenidizing citations in luxury tableware across long distances appears as signals for their use as a sort of aspirational format. On a political level, for example, this can be taken to symbolize the unity of peoples of the empire, and I think that's one of Henry's Colburn's formulations of this. Or, as Joseph put it this morning, it's a common ideologically charged self-image. Such objects operate to our eyes as long-distance signals of belonging. On the medium range level, they appear to circulate as delegates of empire. That's Kajadorian's phrase. On the micro level, they influence the expression of social relations, both within and beyond the empire. All of these theorized material interactions depend on the concept of a permeable imperial identity, which could be co-opted and manipulated in a multi-way discourse. Although, in fact, and this is a small axe to grind on my part, the identity that is the focus of that discourse is usually not the abstract empire itself, but the king and his objects and his peoples. So, on to exotica. One of the most frequently recognised exotica at Persepolis for its foreignness is the Aegean originating sculpture of a woman recovered from the treasury. She is thus a captive, or interpreted as a captive, lute, or diplomatic symbol. Her deracinated status is assumed to be unrelenting in our scholarship, and on that I quote Clayton Olmsted's original publication from 1950, but in fact it's extremely resonant through the words of publications up until very recently. And she's most often portrayed removed from any of her Achaemenid contexts, and even the original context depicted in the photographs from the excavation on the left are not great as a way of integrating it in our understanding of the treasury. So she's most often portrayed removed, and I want to go back to the exhibition in Milan from 2017 there. Portrayed removed from her Achaemenid context, yet the patterns of damage to her body suggest that she suffered the same iconoclastic fate as several monumental images of the Persian king in other structures of the site. While perhaps her marble created a shock of recognition among troops familiar with Western Asia in 330 BCE, we cannot also discount the sense that she became a co-opted subject of the king. The marble sculpture itself in our modern scholarship is usually considered to be the output of a contemporary political process in the early 4th century at the empire's western edge. Therefore, it is not normally considered among the other contents of the treasury, which are not associated with things going on in the western edge. Again, I cannot sort of do that integration in this short paper today, but I do want to use other objects from the treasury to cast different sort of shadows, as it were, on the statue's profile in our thinking. So as a second example, I want to bring up into the discussion the range of inscribed mobile votive objects whose inscriptions suggest they originated in cultic contexts of the 7th to the 6th centuries BCE in Assyria and Babylonia. So, for example, plate 25. This is plate 25 from Schmidt's publication. The eye stone, the inscribed eye stone in the middle, number 2, is inscribed as a dedication to a goddess by Sargon, king of Assyria. Schmidt's publication of these artifacts focuses on the available comparanda for identifying the contents, analogues, and completions of these Mesopotamian originating artifacts. In his introduction, though, he introduces this class of material as votive objects which had once presumably been deposited in temples. And many of the objects' features show that they had been part of enhanced or combined object assemblages, either contemporary Mesopotamian or later settings in precious metal. Many had been ripped apart from their original precious metal settings as part of the process of looting. Schmidt comments, during the looting of the site, the stones were apparently pried or smashed from their settings and discarded. Not considered here by Schmidt are the potential variations in these objects' history, most of which centre around the consideration of how they reached Persepolis from Nineveh or Babylon. Schmidt assumes that the only looters in the story will have been the troops accompanying Alexander in 330 BCE. But what if these objects were in the king's treasury not just as the result of tribute or gift-giving, but instead were relics of the violent plunder of Assyrian and Babylonian shrines in the course of conquest or perhaps reconquest? This idea, I admit, is contentious on many levels, since we have no evidence either way. It is pure speculation. However, I introduce it because it raises the possibility of there being multiple historical strands attached to the objects in the treasury, including the potential inheritance of violence and the participation of expansionist actors other than the Persians, that is, the Elamites or the Medes. And this is where I'm going to zigzag to use the potential for the Mesopotamian votives of the treasury to have been loot from earlier conquests to bring in the dubious history and adjacency of the Medes in the definition of Achaemenid kingship. And I'll just try to do this quite briefly, to note that in the Bizertun inscription, a challenger to the kingship is Gaumata, and in the Babylonian version of that Bizertun inscription, Gaumata is a Mede. He appears in only one version of the story, the Babylonian version, and it's an odd, it's regarded by various commentators as an odd feature that needs to be explained by sort of external applications of analysis, a couple of which I give you here. Medes, in fact, lurk within the textual definition of the Persian monarchy in both Achaemenid and Greek sources, rendering it an odd kingship-adjacent category. And there are other kingship-adjacent ethnic categories as well, but this is the easiest one to bring you today. In the Bizertun inscription, Gaumata the Mede is kind of the opposite of a king. He's also rather the phantom of one, and Gaumata is somebody who is really doing the wrong thing religiously in the process of sort of ruining the progress of the Persian kingship. And as a further example, I just want to note, in fact, I will go over that, that the use of the Medes as problematic intervention sort of peoples who intervene in the proper exercise of power is, of course, not new to this Achaemenid context, but is also something that is present in our Neo-Babylonian texts, both in relation to the stabilization of the Neo-Babylonian monarchy which is what is being mentioned here, in Nabonidus' Sipar cylinder, but also in the bringing down of the of the Assyrian Empire by the Babylonian and the Median armies. So I will skip over some of this because I realise this is going to go longer, and I wrote a longer version of this. But the hybridization of these features, the hybridization of the kingship is something that is elaborated in the work of Herodotus, in his characterization of Cyrus himself as half Median. And this ability to splice the identities of our kings, our Persian kings, is something that persists in our Greek sources. So, realizing that I'm slightly running out of time, I just want to note that I introduced that sort of textual history, or that textual tangent, to note that the perception and the use of other identities adjacent to the Persian king is something that persists through the Achaemenid period, is particularly unstable, let's say, in some of our the narrative histories of Achaemenid kingship, the sort of legitimization of Achaemenid kingship. My final material example that I want to look at here are the Egyptian thresholds, or the Egyptian lintels at Persepolis. These deep thresholds through which one could step into sort of privileged environments in columned halls are something that are already a feature in the architecture of Pasargadae. But they do not seem to feature this curved, Egyptianizing curved Cafetto moulding. This is something that appears here in the 100-columned hall, the central building, and in the royal tombs. And it's something commented upon by Schmidt, mainly as a comparison to the constructions in Egypt during the reign of Darius. And he draws a direct comparison between the Egyptianized lintels at Persepolis and those being constructed as part of shrine and temple construction in Egypt during that period. This, in this case, is exoticism in plain sight, so common and pervasive in the architecture of Persepolis that we rarely comment on it apart from to call it Egyptianizing Cafetto moulding. Is this domesticated exoticism? Is this an exoticism which loses its foreignness quite quickly? That's a question that I want to raise. Its hybridity here depends on memory and imagined external spatial reference, as is in Egypt. The Cafetto cornice evokes dynastic and sacred space in Egypt, and by implication includes historic spaces there in this construction in the Palace of Darius. The architecture of Persepolis is thus a spliced genealogy, analogous to the multilingual royal genealogies inscribed in the door jambs, encased by these lintels in the palaces of Darius and Xerxes. The permanent materializations of Egyptian and Assyrian thresholds at Persepolis are analogous but subtler versions of the transference of a Babylonian gateway to the plain of Persepolis. All are portals that collapse the spatial and chronological distance between Achaemenid dynastic space and the worlds of past kings far away. This is true not just of the publicly prominent architectural piers and lintels, but also of relics held in the less visible spaces of the treasury. So what I hope, and this I realise has been a sort of touching on summary examples, but what I hope that the discussion suggests is that this integration of older nodes of kingship in the material and spatial world of the Achaemenid court potentially entangles the Persians in more complicated histories than the direct succession of empires. The Persian kings here entered the world of pharaonic kingship relatively recently, relatively recent conquest, and this continues that conquest in the territory of Persepolis. And I could go on to sort of discuss also the use of the Lamassu icon as well as a relic of a lost empire, but I will finish there. Thank you.